The credit card statement trembled in Sarah's hands as she stared at the charges that would shatter her entire world. Serenity Springs Wellness Resort, 4 separate weekend stays, couples massage packages, wine therapy sessions, all while her husband had supposedly been attending quarterly sales conferences in different cities across the state. The worst part wasn't the money he'd spent, or even the elaborate lies he'd crafted. It was the second name on the reservations that made her stomach drop like a stone. Marcus Chen. His coworker, his supposed best friend, the man who had been their wedding's best man just 3 years ago. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Martinez had always prided herself on being observant. As a forensic accountant for a prestigious firm in downtown Seattle, she made her living finding discrepancies that others missed, following paper trails that revealed hidden truths. She could spot financial irregularities in complex corporate structures with ease, yet somehow she had missed the deception happening under her own roof for months. The discovery came on a rainy Thursday evening in October, the kind of Seattle drizzle that seemed to seep into everything. She had been reconciling their joint credit card statements, a monthly ritual she performed with the same meticulous attention she brought to her professional work. David always handled his business expenses separately, claiming it made tax season easier for his automotive parts sales job. She had never questioned this arrangement, trusting her husband of 3 years implicitly. But this month, a clerical error at the credit card company had merged some of his business charges onto their joint statement. Sarah almost didn't notice at first, skimming past what appeared to be legitimate business expenses. Then she saw it. Serenity Springs Wellness Resort, a luxury spa retreat in the Cascade Mountains, charging their account for a weekend stay in September. The same weekend, David had told her he was attending a mandatory sales conference in Portland. Her fingers moved across her laptop keyboard with practiced efficiency, pulling up their account history online. What she found made her blood run cold. 3 more charges over the past 4 months, each corresponding perfectly with weekends David claimed to be away on business. The amounts were staggering. Premium suite accommodations, couples massage packages, wine therapy sessions, gourmet dining experiences. This wasn't business travel. This was romantic getaways. The reservation details were what truly broke her heart. Each booking was made for 2 guests, and the second name listed was always the same: Marcus Chen, David's coworker at Northwest Automotive Solutions, the man who had stood beside David at their wedding altar, promising to support their marriage through good times and bad. The same Marcus who came to their house for barbecues, who brought thoughtful gifts for Sarah's birthday, who she had considered not just David's friend, but her friend too. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process what she was seeing. David and Marcus, together, at romantic spa retreats, while she worked late nights, missing dinners and anniversaries, because she thought she was being the supportive wife who understood the demands of her husband's career. She felt nauseated as she remembered all the times she had encouraged David to maintain his friendship with Marcus, even suggesting they planned guy trips together. The apartment suddenly felt suffocating. Sarah grabbed her coat and keys, needing air, needing space to think. She drove aimlessly through Seattle's rain-slick streets, her mind replaying every interaction she had with both men over the past months. Had there been signs? Lingering glances she'd missed? Inside jokes that excluded her? The more she thought about it, the more obvious it seemed in retrospect. Marcus had been coming around more frequently lately, often staying late into the evening, supposedly discussing work projects. David had been increasingly distant, claiming exhaustion from his demanding travel schedule. He had stopped initiating physical intimacy, always having some excuse about being tired or stressed. When she tried to plan weekend getaways for just the 2 of them, he always seemed to have conflicting work obligations. Sarah found herself parked outside her older sister Alina's house in Ballard, not really remembering the drive there. Alina answered the door in her scrubs, just home from her shift as a nurse at Swedish Medical Center. One look at Sarah's face, and Alina was pulling her inside, wrapping her in the kind of fierce, protective embrace that only sisters could provide. "What happened?" Alina asked, guiding Sarah to the couch in her cozy living room. Sarah showed her the credit card statements on her phone, watching her expression shift from confusion to anger to heartbreak on Sarah's behalf. "I can't believe this," Alina said, scrolling through the charges. "David and Marcus? I mean, I always thought Marcus was a little too friendly, but I never imagined." She trailed off, then looked directly at Sarah. "What are you going to do?" That was the question Sarah had been avoiding. What did you do when you discovered your husband was having an affair with his male coworker? How did you confront a betrayal that seemed to encompass not just infidelity, but also a fundamental deception about who your partner truly was? Sarah said, "I need to know for sure. I need to see it for myself." Alina looked concerned. "Sarah, honey, those credit card statements are pretty definitive proof." "I know what they show," Sarah replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "But I need to understand what this means. Is David gay? Has he been living a lie our entire marriage? Is this just about Marcus, or have there been others? I can't make any decisions until I know what I'm actually dealing with."
Marcus got out of the passenger side, and even from a distance, Sarah could see the easy intimacy between them. The way Marcus placed his hand on the small of David's back as they walked toward the main building, the way David leaned into Marcus's touch, the way they looked at each other with unmistakable love. Sarah sank onto her bed, finally understanding that this wasn't just an affair, this was a relationship. David wasn't just cheating on her, he was living an authentic life with someone else while maintaining a facade with her. The realization hit her like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs. She spent the rest of the weekend in her room, ordering room service and trying to process the magnitude of what she'd discovered. Occasionally, she glimpsed David and Marcus from her window, walking the resort's trails hand in hand, sharing meals on the outdoor terrace, looking like exactly what they were, a couple in love enjoying a romantic getaway. The drive back to Seattle on Sunday evening was surreal. Sarah knew that when she walked into her apartment, she would have to decide how to confront David. Part of her wanted to rage at him for the deception, for the months of lies, for making her feel like she was inadequate as a wife when the truth was that she could never be what he needed because she wasn't a man. But another part of her, the part that had loved David genuinely for 4 years, felt heartbroken for him too. How terrifying must it have been to realize you were day after you'd already married someone? How impossible must it have seemed to tell the truth? David was in the kitchen when she arrived, unpacking takeout from their favorite Thai restaurant. He looked tan and relaxed, and Sarah realized he probably actually had been at some kind of retreat, just not the professional kind he'd claimed. "Hey, babe," he said, kissing her cheek. "How was your weekend? I missed you." The casual normalcy of the moment after what she'd witnessed felt absurd. Sarah looked at this man she'd shared a bed with for 3 years, this person she'd planned a future with, and realized she didn't know him at all. "We need to talk," she said. David's expression shifted, the easy smile fading as he registered something in her tone. "Is everything okay?" Sarah pulled out her phone and showed him the credit card statement. "You tell me." The color drained from David's face as he stared at the screen. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then David sank onto one of the kitchen stools, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. "A week," Sarah replied. "I drove up to Serenity Springs this weekend. I saw you and Marcus together." David's head dropped into his hands. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen." "How long?" she asked again, this time asking about the relationship, not her knowledge of it. 6 months, David admitted. Maybe 7. It started gradually. We'd always been close friends, but then one night after a work event, we ended up talking until dawn about everything. Life, relationships, feelings we'd never admitted to anyone, and then it just happened. Sarah felt oddly calm listening to this confession. The anger she'd expected to feel was absent, replaced by a strange sense of relief that the pretending was finally over. "Are you gay, David?" she asked directly. He looked up at her with tears in his eyes. "I think so. Yes, I've been trying to understand it myself, but yes,
I think I've always known, somewhere deep down, but I convinced myself I could ignore it, that loving you would be enough. But it wasn't. No, he whispered, and that's not a reflection of you, Sarah. You're an amazing woman. Any straight man would be lucky to have you. But I'm not straight, and pretending to be was killing both of us. They talked through the night, sometimes crying, sometimes sitting in silence, slowly dismantling their marriage with the same care they'd once used to build it. David explained how he'd struggled with his sexuality since college, how he thought marriage to someone he genuinely cared about would fix him, how the realization that he was gay had sent him into a panic about his entire identity. I kept thinking if I could just try harder, be a better husband, force myself to feel what I thought I should feel, David said as dawn approached. But then Marcus and I got closer, and for the first time in my life, everything felt natural and right. I knew I couldn't keep living a lie, but I also couldn't bear the thought of hurting you. So you decided to hurt me gradually instead of all at once? Sarah asked, not accusatorily, that with genuine curiosity about his reasoning. He winced. I was being a coward. I kept thinking I'd find the right way to tell you, the right time, but there never seemed to be one. And the longer it went on, the harder it became to imagine how to undo everything we'd built together. As the sun rose over Elliott Bay, visible through their apartment's large windows, Sarah and David sat across from each other at their dining room table, surrounded by the debris of their shared life. Wedding photos, vacation souvenirs, furniture they'd chosen together. It all felt like artifacts of someone else's life now. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. "I don't know," he admitted. "I know I need to be honest about who I am, finally. And I know you deserve someone who can love you the way you deserve to be loved. What about Marcus?" David's expression softened when his boyfriend's name was mentioned. "He's been patient with the situation for months. He understood that I needed time to figure out how to handle things with you, but it's been hard on him too, being a secret." Sarah nodded, understanding that she wasn't the only person who had been hurt by this situation. Marcus had been forced to hide his relationship, to pretend to be just a friend when he was so much more.
"I want to meet with him," Sarah said suddenly. David looked startled. "What? Why?" "Because he's been part of our lives for years, and now he's going to be part of your life going forward. If we're going to figure out how to untangle this mess, I think we need to all be honest with each other." The meeting took place 3 days later at a coffee shop in Fremont, neutral territory that didn't belong to any of their histories together. Marcus arrived first, looking nervous and uncomfortable, clearly dreading the confrontation he assumed was coming. When Sarah walked in, he stood up automatically, then seemed unsure whether to hug her or shake her hand or maintain distance. "Sit down, Marcus," Sarah said gently. "We're all adults here." David arrived a few minutes later, and the three of them sat around a small table, an awkward triangle of complicated emotions and uncertain futures. "I owe you an apology," Marcus said before either Sarah or David could speak. "I never intended to fall in love with your husband. I've been David's friend for years, and I've always liked and respected you. I feel terrible about the deception." Sarah studied Marcus's face, seeing genuine remorse and discomfort. "Are you in love with him?" she asked. Marcus glanced at David, then back at Sarah. "Yes, I know that's probably painful for you to hear, but yes." "And David, are you in love with him?" David's answer was quiet but clear. "Yes." Sarah nodded, processing this confirmation. "Then we need to figure out how to end my marriage and start your relationship without destroying everyone involved." Over the next 2 hours, the three of them had one of the strangest and most honest conversations of Sarah's life. Marcus talked about his own journey accepting his sexuality, having come out in college and dated men openly for years before meeting David. David discussed his confusion and self-denial, his fear of disappointing his traditional family, his struggle to reconcile his feelings with his assumed identity. Sarah found herself oddly moved by their story, despite being the casualty of it. There was genuine love between them, the kind of natural compatibility she'd always hoped to find, but had never quite experienced with David. Watching them together, she could see how much sense they made as a couple, how their personalities complemented each other in ways that her marriage to David never had.
"I have one request," Sarah said as they prepared to leave. "I want you to be honest with people about what happened. I don't want to be painted as the villain in this story, or as someone who couldn't keep her husband satisfied. I want people to know that David is gay, that this wasn't about me not being enough." Both men agreed immediately, understanding that Sarah's reputation and sense of self shouldn't be casualties of David's journey to authenticity. The divorce proceedings were surprisingly amicable. They divided their assets fairly, sold their apartment, and David moved in with Marcus while Sarah found a smaller place in Capitol Hill. Their mutual friends were initially shocked by the revelation, but most were ultimately supportive once they understood the situation. The hardest part for Sarah wasn't the practical aspects of divorce, but the existential questions it raised about her own judgment and future. If she could be so wrong about something as fundamental as her husband's sexuality, what else might she be missing about the people in her life? How could she trust her instincts about relationships when they had failed her so completely? Part 2. The Rebuilding. 6 months after her divorce was finalized, Sarah threw herself into work with an intensity that concerned her friends and family. She took on the most complex cases, worked late into the evening, and volunteered for weekend assignments that kept her mind occupied and her social calendar empty. Her colleagues at Morrison & Associates began referring to her as the machine for her tireless dedication and flawless analysis. Elena worried about her sister's social isolation and tried repeatedly to convince Sarah to start dating again, but Sarah deflected these suggestions with practiced ease. The idea of opening herself up to another relationship, of trusting someone else with her heart, felt impossible. How could she ever again believe that she truly knew someone? "You can't let David's situation make you afraid of all relationships," Elena argued during one of their weekly dinners at Pike Place Market. "He wasn't lying because he wanted to hurt you. He was lying because he was scared and confused about himself." "I understand that intellectually," Sarah replied, picking at her salmon. "But emotionally, it doesn't matter why someone lies to you for months. The result is the same. I lived in a false reality without knowing it." Elena sighed, recognizing the stubborn set of her sister's jaw that had been present since childhood. "What if you started smaller, just casual dating, getting to know people without any pressure for serious commitment?" Sarah had considered this suggestion, but the thought of making small talk with strangers about their hopes and dreams felt exhausting. She downloaded dating apps at Elena's insistence, but after scrolling through profiles of men claiming to love hiking and traveling, she deleted them without creating an account. Work provided the perfect escape from these personal complications. Sarah's reputation for uncovering financial fraud had grown throughout the Seattle business community, and she was increasingly called in to consult on high-profile cases. It was during one such case, investigating embezzlement at a nonprofit arts organization, that she met James. The Pacific Northwest Arts Foundation was housed in a converted warehouse in Georgetown, all exposed brick and soaring ceilings filled with natural light. Sarah arrived on a Tuesday morning in March to begin her investigation into financial irregularities that the board had discovered during their annual audit. She was met at the reception desk by the foundation's program director, a man about her age with kind eyes and paint-stained fingers. "You must be Sarah Martinez," he said, extending his hand. "I'm James Sullivan. Thanks for coming in to help us sort this mess out." James had the kind of warm, genuine smile that put people immediately at ease. He was tall and lean with dark hair that looked like he'd run his fingers through it while concentrating. And when he spoke about the foundation's mission, his passion was evident in every word. "We provide grants and support to emerging artists throughout the region," he explained as he led Sarah through the workspace, past studios where artists were creating sculptures, paintings, and multimedia installations. Sarah was struck by the vibrancy of the environment. Her accounting firm's offices were all muted colors and quiet professionalism, but this space buzzed with creative energy. Musicians practiced in soundproof booths, painters worked at easels by large windows, and a group of dancers rehearsed in a studio with mirrors covering one entire wall. "It's impressive," Sarah said, meaning it. "How long have you been with the foundation?" 8 years, James replied. "I started as a volunteer while I was teaching high school art, then gradually took on more responsibilities. The previous director retired 2 years ago, and I was lucky enough to be promoted into the role. As James showed her to the conference room where she'd be working, Sarah found herself genuinely curious about him in a way she hadn't felt about anyone in months. There was something refreshing about his obvious dedication to his work, his enthusiasm for helping others pursue their artistic dreams. "I have to ask," Sarah said as James pulled files from a cabinet, "when you discovered the financial irregularities, why didn't you just call the police? Most organizations would have handled this differently."
James paused in his file organization, considering her question. Because whoever did this might be someone I know, someone I've worked with and trusted. If it turns out that one of our staff members was stealing from artists who were already struggling financially, I want to understand why before I decide how to respond. Maybe they were desperate. Maybe they had personal circumstances I didn't know about. I'm not excusing theft, but I believe in trying to understand people's motivations before rushing to judgment. This response surprised Sarah. In her experience, executives who discovered embezzlement usually wanted swift, decisive action that protected their organization's reputation. James's approach suggested both compassion and wisdom that was rare in the business world. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah spent her days immersed in the foundation's financial records, tracking transactions and identifying patterns that would reveal who had been skimming money from grant disbursements. She worked primarily in the conference room, but James would often stop by to check on her progress or offer coffee and conversation. These interactions were the highlight of Sarah's days. James had a way of talking about art and creativity that made even someone with no artistic background understand the importance of the foundation's work. He told her about a young photographer they'd supported who was now having her work exhibited in galleries across the country, about a musician who'd used their grant to record an album that was gaining national attention, about a sculptor whose public installations were transforming neighborhoods throughout Seattle. "It's not just about the money," James explained during one of these conversations. "It's about believing in someone's vision when they're not sure anyone else will. Sometimes that belief is more valuable than the financial support." Sarah found herself staying later than necessary, not just to finish her work, but to continue talking with James. He was knowledgeable about literature and film, had traveled extensively through Europe studying art history, and had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh in ways she hadn't in months. "Why did you leave teaching?" Sarah asked one evening as they shared takeout Chinese food in the conference room. Most of the staff had gone home, leaving the building quiet except for a jazz trio practicing in one of the studios. "Budget cuts," James said with a rueful smile. "The school district kept reducing arts funding, and eventually they eliminated my position entirely. I was devastated at first, but working here has taught me that there are many ways to support artists and creativity. Sometimes losing one path opens up another one you never would have considered." There was something profound in this observation that resonated with Sarah's current situation. Her marriage ending had felt like a complete derailment of her life plan, but perhaps it had also created space for possibilities she hadn't previously imagined. "Do you ever miss the classroom?" she asked one evening as they shared takeout Chinese food in the conference room. Most of the staff had gone home, leaving the building quiet except for a jazz trio practicing in one of the studios. "Budget cuts," James said with a rueful smile. "The school district kept reducing arts funding, and eventually they eliminated my position entirely. I was devastated at first, but working here has taught me that there are many ways to support artists and creativity. Sometimes losing one path opens up another one you never would have considered." There was something profound in this observation that resonated with Sarah's current situation. Her marriage ending had felt like a complete derailment of her life plan, but perhaps it had also created space for possibilities she hadn't previously imagined. "Do you ever miss the classroom?" she asked. "Sometimes," James admitted. "There's something special about seeing a teenager discover they can create something beautiful, something uniquely theirs. But I get to see that here too, just with artists at different stages of their careers." By the end of the second week, Sarah had identified the source of the embezzlement. The foundation's bookkeeper had been systematically skimming small amounts from multiple grant payments over the course of 18 months. The total was significant, nearly $40,000, but the individual amounts were small enough to avoid detection during routine reviews.
Sarah dreaded having to deliver this news to James. She'd grown to respect him enormously over the past 2 weeks, and she knew how personally he would take the betrayal of someone he'd trusted. "It's Rebecca," she said when James arrived at the conference room on Friday afternoon. "Your bookkeeper has been taking money from the grant disbursements." James closed his eyes for a long moment, absorbing this information. "Rebecca," he repeated softly. "She's been with us for 5 years. She knows every artist we support, attends their gallery openings, celebrates their successes with us." "I'm sorry," Sarah said, meaning it. "I know this is difficult." James opened his eyes and looked directly at her. "What would you do if you were in my position?" The question surprised Sarah. In her professional experience, clients usually wanted her to provide facts and recommendations, not engage in complex ethical discussions about how to handle the results of her investigations. "What are the circumstances?" Sarah asked. "Does Rebecca have family, financial pressures you know about?" "She's a single mother with 2 kids," James said. "Her ex-husband stopped paying child support about 2 years ago, and she's been struggling to make ends meet. But Sarah, if she needed help, she could have come to me. We have an emergency fund for staff members facing financial hardship." Sarah nodded. Understanding James's disappointment ran deeper than just the theft itself. "You feel like she didn't trust you to ask for help." "Exactly. And now I have to decide whether to call the police or try to handle this internally somehow." James ran his hands through his hair, clearly wrestling with the decision. "If I have her arrested, she'll lose her job and probably have trouble finding another one with a theft conviction. Her kids will suffer. But if I don't report it, am I being fair to the artists whose money she stole?" Sarah found herself drawn into this moral complexity in a way that surprised her. Usually, her job ended when she identified the perpetrator. What happened next was someone else's responsibility. "What if you gave her a chance to explain herself first?" Sarah suggested. "Maybe there's something you don't know about her situation." James looked thoughtful. "Would you be willing to be present for that conversation? As a witness, and because you understand the scope of what she did better than I do?" Sarah agreed, though she wasn't sure why. Something about James's approach to this situation, his desire to understand rather than simply punish, appealed to her sense of fairness in a way that surprised her. The meeting with Rebecca took place the following Monday morning. When James explained what Sarah had discovered, Rebecca broke down completely, confirming the theft through her tears and explaining the circumstances that had led to her desperate decision. "My youngest daughter needed surgery last year," Rebecca sobbed. "Insurance covered most of it, but I still owed thousands in copays and deductibles. Then my car broke down and I couldn't afford to fix it and make the medical payments. I kept telling myself I'd pay it back, that it was just a loan I was giving myself, but it kept getting harder to replace the money." James listened with compassion while Sarah took notes, documenting Rebecca's admission for whatever legal proceedings might follow. But as Rebecca continued her explanation, Sarah found herself thinking not about prosecution, but about solutions. "Rebecca," Sarah interrupted gently, "if you had to pay this money back, how long would it take you?" Rebecca looked up, surprised by the question. I don't know."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"Maybe 5 years if I could make monthly payments?" Sarah looked at James, seeing him consider possibilities. "What if we structured this as a payment plan rather than a termination and prosecution?" Over the next hour, the 3 of them worked out an arrangement that seemed fair to everyone involved. Rebecca would repay the stolen money through payroll deductions over 5 years, with interest. She would be demoted from bookkeeper to administrative assistant, with Sarah helping the foundation implement new financial controls to prevent future theft. Rebecca would keep her job and avoid criminal charges, but she would also face ongoing accountability for her actions. "Thank you," Rebecca whispered as they finalized the agreement. "I know I don't deserve this second chance." "Everyone deserves a second chance," James replied, "but this is your only one. If anything like this happens again, I won't hesitate to involve law enforcement." After Rebecca left, Sarah and James sat in the conference room, both emotionally drained by the intensity of the morning's conversation. "That was the right thing to do," Sarah said. "I hope so," James replied.
It felt right, but I'm not sure my board will see it that way. They hired you to make these kinds of decisions, Sarah pointed out. If they trust your judgment about supporting artists, they should trust your judgment about managing staff. James smiled at her, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him all morning. Thank you for helping me think through this. I couldn't have handled it alone. Actually, you could have, Sarah said. You would have found a compassionate solution because that's who you are. You just needed someone to help you see that mercy and accountability aren't mutually exclusive. As Sarah packed up her files and prepared to return to her regular cases, she realized she was reluctant to leave the foundation. The past 3 weeks had been the most engaged and fulfilled she'd felt since her divorce. Working with James had reminded her that not all professional relationships had to be purely transactional, that some people approach their work with genuine care for others. Would you be interested in staying on as a consultant? James asked as she loaded her briefcase. We could use someone to help us implement better financial controls, and frankly, I'd value your perspective on future decisions. Sarah felt a flutter of excitement at the possibility of continuing to work with James, but she also felt the familiar fear that had kept her isolated for months. Getting close to people led to complications, and complications led to pain. I'll think about it, she said, which was more commitment than she'd been willing to make to anyone about anything in a long time. That evening, Elena called to check in on her sister's week, as she did every Monday. You sound different, Elena observed after Sarah had described the situation with Rebecca and James's compassionate response. More, I don't know, more like yourself again. What do you mean? More engaged, more curious about people, less like you're just going through the motions of living. Sarah considered this observation. Elena was right. The past 3 weeks had felt more vibrant and meaningful than the previous 6 months combined. I think I might take on this consulting arrangement, Sarah said. Because of the work or because of James? Elena's question was direct, as always, and Sarah found herself unable to deflect it with her usual professional explanations. Maybe both, she admitted. Good, Elena said with satisfaction. It's time you started letting people into your life again. I'm not ready for a relationship, Sarah said quickly. I didn't say anything about a relationship. I said people. Friends, colleagues, acquaintances who might become friends. You've been living like a hermit, and that's not healthy for anyone. Elena was right, Sarah realized. She'd been so focused on protecting herself from romantic disappointment that she'd isolated herself from all meaningful human connections. Working with James had reminded her how much she enjoyed collaborating with someone whose values aligned with her own, how satisfying it could be to solve problems with someone who cared about the human impact of their decisions. The next morning, Sarah called James to accept the consulting position. She told herself it was purely professional, that she was making the decision based on the interesting work and the foundation's important mission. But when James's obvious delight at her acceptance made her smile for the rest of the day, she admitted to herself that there might be more to her decision than professional interest. Part 3. The Truth and Resolution. 6 months into her consulting arrangement with the Pacific Northwest Arts Foundation, Sarah had settled into a routine that felt more fulfilling than anything she'd experienced in years. She spent 3 days a week at the foundation, helping them implement new financial systems and reviewing grant applications for feasibility. The remaining 2 days, she worked on cases for Morrison and Associates, maintaining her forensic accounting practice while exploring this new intersection of finance and social good. Her relationship with James had evolved from professional collaboration to genuine friendship. They had lunch together most days she was at the foundation, often walking to nearby restaurants or food trucks while discussing everything from foundation business to books they'd read, movies they'd seen, and their respective thoughts on Seattle's evolving art scene. Sarah found herself looking forward to these conversations with an anticipation that both delighted and worried her. James was easy to talk to, genuinely interested in her perspectives, and had a way of asking questions that helped her clarify her own thoughts about complex issues. When she mentioned struggling with trust issues following her divorce, He listened without offering unwanted advice or trying to minimize her concerns. Trust isn't binary, he'd observed during one such conversation. It's not a switch you turn on or off. It's more like a dimmer that you adjust based on experience and evidence. This insight had stayed with Sarah, helping her recognize that she could allow herself to trust James with small things without committing to trusting him with everything immediately. She could appreciate his kindness without assuming he had ulterior motives. She could enjoy his company without assuming it would lead to romantic complications. Elena noticed the change in her sister during their weekly dinners, commenting on how much more relaxed and animated Sarah seemed. "You're laughing again," Elena observed as they shared dessert at their favorite Capitol Hill restaurant. "Real laughs, not just polite social responses." "The work is satisfying," Sarah replied, though she knew Elena was fishing for information about James, who she'd mentioned several times in recent weeks. "And James?" "And James is a good friend and colleague," Sarah said firmly. Elena raised an eyebrow but didn't press the point, recognizing that her sister needed to process her feelings at her own pace. The shift in Sarah's perspective on James began during a crisis at the foundation in early December. A major donor had accused them of misusing grant funds, threatening to withdraw his support and demanding a public audit of their financial practices. The allegation was baseless, but it had the potential to damage the foundation's reputation and jeopardize other funding sources. Sarah worked around the clock for a week, preparing a comprehensive financial analysis that demonstrated the foundation's responsible stewardship of donor funds. James coordinated with the board and the accused donors' representatives, remaining calm and professional despite the stress of potentially losing funding that supported dozens of artists. During this crisis, Sarah saw sides of James she hadn't previously witnessed.
His ability to remain diplomatic while under attack, his strategic thinking about how to protect the foundation's reputation, his genuine concern for the artists who would suffer if they lost funding. She also saw how the staff rallied around him, clearly trusting his leadership even in difficult circumstances. "You saved us," James said, after the donors' representatives reviewed Sarah's analysis and withdrew their accusations. "If we'd had to hire an outside firm to prepare this kind of comprehensive audit, it would have taken months and cost more than we could afford." "That's what friends do," Sarah replied, surprised by how natural it felt to use that word in reference to James. "Is that what we are?" James asked, his expression serious. "Friends?" The question hung between them, loaded with possibility and uncertainty. Sarah realized that over the past months, her feelings for James had evolved beyond simple friendship, but she still felt too fragile, too uncertain about her judgment, to risk acknowledging that evolution. "I hope so," she said carefully. James nodded, accepting her caution with the same patience he'd shown throughout their developing relationship. "I hope so too." As the holidays approached, Sarah found herself facing her first Christmas season since the divorce with something approaching optimism. She'd agreed to attend the foundation's holiday party, her first social event since ending her marriage. Elena had convinced her to buy a new dress, arguing that it was time to stop hiding behind professional suits at all social occasions. The party was held at the foundation's warehouse space, transformed for the evening with string lights, live music from artists they supported, and an exhibition of works created by grant recipients throughout the year. Sarah arrived feeling nervous about socializing with James's colleagues and the foundation's board members, but she quickly found herself engaged in fascinating conversations about art, creativity, and the role of arts funding in community development. "You're a natural at this," James said, appearing at her side as she finished a conversation with a board member about the economic impact of arts organizations on local neighborhoods. "At what?" "Understanding how creativity and commerce intersect. You see the human impact of financial decisions in a way that most accountants don't." Sarah felt herself flush with pleasure at the compliment. "I'm learning that numbers tell stories about people's lives. It's more interesting than I ever realized." James was about to respond when his expression suddenly changed, his attention focusing on something behind Sarah. She turned to see what had caught his attention and felt her stomach drop. David and Marcus stood near the entrance, looking around the room uncertainly.
They were both dressed nicely, clearly there as invited guests rather than party crashers, but their presence at an event where Sarah felt safe and happy felt like an intrusion from a life she'd worked hard to move beyond. "Friends of yours?" James asked quietly, clearly sensing Sarah's distress. "My ex-husband and his boyfriend," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I didn't know they had any connection to the foundation." James's expression shifted to protective concern. "Do you want me to ask them to leave?" "No," Sarah said, surprising herself with the firmness of her response. "I can't spend my life avoiding places where they might appear. Besides, they're probably here for a legitimate reason." As if summoned by her words, David began walking toward them, Marcus following reluctantly behind. Sarah hadn't seen David since their divorce was finalized 8 months ago, and she was struck by how happy and healthy he looked. His relationship with Marcus had clearly been good for him, allowing him to live authentically in a way that had been impossible during their marriage. "Sarah," David said as he approached, his voice careful and respectful, "I'm sorry to intrude on your evening. We're here because Marcus has been working with one of your artists on a photography project." Sarah looked at Marcus, remembering that he was a talented photographer in addition to his automotive sales career. "Oh. I've been documenting the restoration of vintage cars for a series about American craftsmanship," Marcus explained, clearly uncomfortable with the unexpected encounter. "The foundation connected me with some metalworkers and painters who specialize in automotive restoration. It's been an amazing collaborative project." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Sarah. Marcus was pursuing artistic work that brought him joy, something that wouldn't have been possible during the deception of their secret relationship. David's authentic happiness was evident in every aspect of his demeanor. Everyone's lives had improved since the truth came out, even though the process had been painful. "That sounds fascinating," James interjected, offering his hand to both men. "I'm James Sullivan, the Foundation's program director. Your photography project has been getting excellent reviews from the artists you've been working with." As James engaged David and Marcus in conversation about the photography project, Sarah found herself observing the interaction with detachment. David looked genuinely pleased for her when James mentioned that Sarah was consulting with the foundation, and Marcus asked thoughtful questions about her work that demonstrated he held no resentment about the way their secret relationship had been discovered. "You look happy," David said, during a moment when James was explaining the foundation's mission to Marcus. "I mean that sincerely. I worried about you after everything that happened." "I'm figuring things out," Sarah replied honestly. "It took time, but I think I'm okay." "Good," David said, and she could see that he meant it. "You deserve to be happy." The conversation might have remained awkward but polite if a commotion near the entrance hadn't drawn everyone's attention. A woman in an expensive coat was arguing loudly with one of the foundation staff members, her voice carrying across the room despite the background music. "I demand to speak with James Sullivan immediately," the woman was saying. "This organization has been lying to donors, and I won't stand for it." Sarah recognized the voice before she saw the face. Vanessa Hartwell, the donor's wife who had accused the foundation of financial mismanagement. Sarah's analysis had disproven the allegations, but apparently Vanessa wasn't satisfied with the resolution. "Excuse me," James said, immediately moving toward the commotion with the calm efficiency Sarah had come to admire. Sarah followed, curious about how James would handle this disruption to the foundation's celebration. She arrived in time to hear Vanessa escalate her accusations. "This so-called financial analysis is obviously biased," Vanessa was saying, waving a copy of Sarah's report. "How convenient that they hired their own consultant to clear them of wrongdoing." "Mrs. Hartwell," James said diplomatically, "as we explained during our previous meeting, Sarah Martinez is one of the most respected forensic accountants in Seattle. Her analysis was thorough and independent." "Independent?" Vanessa laughed bitterly. "She's been working here for months, hardly independent." Sarah stepped forward, recognizing that her professional reputation was being attacked. "Mrs. Hartwell, I'd be happy to explain my methodology and findings. Every transaction I reviewed is documented with supporting evidence." Vanessa turned her attention to Sarah, and Sarah saw something in the woman's expression that seemed familiar, though she couldn't place why.
"You're Sarah Martinez," Vanessa said, her tone shifting to something that sounded almost triumphant. "Sarah Martinez, who used to be Sarah Rodriguez?" "No," Sarah replied, confused. "My maiden name is Martinez. I've never been Sarah Rodriguez." "But you were married to David Chen?"
Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as understanding dawned. David Thompson, she corrected automatically, and you're Vanessa Hartwell, formerly Vanessa Chen, David's ex-wife. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. The woman who had been attacking the foundation, whose false accusations had threatened funding for dozens of artists, was David's first wife. The ex-wife he'd told Sarah about during their marriage, the woman who had divorced him years before Sarah met him. I don't understand, Sarah said, though pieces of the puzzle were starting to form a picture she didn't want to see. David married you while he was still legally married to me, Vanessa said with savage satisfaction. Our divorce was never finalized due to a paperwork error. Your entire marriage was invalid. The room seemed to spin around Sarah as she processed this information. David, who had been standing nearby with Marcus, went pale as he heard Vanessa's accusation. That's not possible, David said, stepping forward. We signed the divorce papers 3 years before I met Sarah. Signed? Yes, Vanessa confirmed, but my attorney never filed them properly. There was a clerical error, and when I discovered it last year, I decided not to correct it. I thought it was amusing that you were living in sin without knowing it. Sarah felt James's hand on her arm, steadying her as the implications of Vanessa's revelation sank in. Not only had her marriage to David been invalid, but she'd been unknowingly complicit in bigamy. Worse, this explained why Vanessa had targeted the foundation for her false accusations. She'd somehow discovered Sarah's connection to the organization and decided to attack it as a way of attacking Sarah. Why? Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. Why would you do this? Because David left me for you, Vanessa said viciously. He claimed he needed time to figure himself out, but then I saw your wedding announcement in the paper. He didn't need time, he needed a replacement wife. That's not what happened, David interjected, moving to Sarah's side despite the awkwardness of defending his ex-wife to his ex-wife. Toxic? Vanessa's voice rose. I supported you through graduate school, helped you build your business, put up with your moods and your uncertainty about everything. Sarah found herself in the surreal position of watching her ex-husband argue with his previous ex-wife about the validity of relationships that no longer existed. The entire situation felt like a bad soap opera, except the emotional damage was real and immediate. Mrs. Hartwell, James interrupted firmly, this is a private matter that has nothing to do with the foundation. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Gladly, Vanessa said, gathering her coat, but don't think this is over. I'll be filing complaints with every relevant oversight body about your financial practices. As Vanessa swept out of the party, leaving behind a room full of shocked guests and unanswered questions, Sarah felt herself beginning to shut down emotionally. Once again, her life had been revealed to be built on deception, only this time the deception had been unknowing on everyone's part, except Vanessa's. Sarah, David said, his voice full of anguish, I had no idea. I swear to you, I thought we were legally divorced. I know, Sarah replied numbly. This isn't your fault. But even as she said the words, Sarah felt the walls she'd spent months slowly lowering slam back into place. How could she trust her judgment about anything when she'd been so wrong about so many fundamental facts of her life? James guided her to a quiet corner of the room, away from the curious stares of other party guests. Are you all right? I need to go home, Sarah said, not meeting his eyes. I'm sorry, I know this is your event, but I can't stay here. Of course, James said immediately. Let me drive you. No, Sarah said quickly. I need to be alone right now. She could see the hurt in James's expression at her rejection, but she couldn't explain that her emotional walls slamming shut had nothing to do with him and everything to do with her own fractured sense of reality. Elena found Sarah at her apartment the next morning, still in her party dress from the night before, sitting on her couch, staring at nothing. James called me, Elena explained as she let herself in with her spare key. He's worried about you. My marriage was invalid, Sarah said without prambling. David was still married to his first wife when he married me. I lived as a bigamist for 3 years without knowing it. Elena sat down beside her sister, processing this information.
So, technically, you were never actually married to David? Technically, legally, completely, Sarah confirmed. And his ex-wife knew about it and used that information to attack the foundation where I work because she somehow figured out I was connected to it. Sarah, Elena said gently, this is insane, but it's not your fault. You had no way of knowing about a paperwork error in David's previous divorce. That's not the point, Sarah said, finally looking at her sister. The point is that nothing in my life has been what I thought it was. My marriage was invalid, my husband was gay, and now I find out that a crazy ex-wife has been orchestrating attacks on my workplace. How am I supposed to trust anything or anyone when I'm clearly terrible at recognizing reality? Elena was quiet for a long moment, clearly searching for the right words. What about James?
What about him? Has he given you any reason not to trust him? Sarah considered this question. No, but David didn't either until I found those credit card statements. David didn't give you reasons not to trust him because he was hiding fundamental truths about himself. James isn't hiding anything. You've seen him handle crises, make difficult decisions, treat people with compassion even when they've disappointed him. You know who he is. I thought I knew who David was, too. Did you, though? Elena asked gently. Really? Looking back honestly, were there signs that David wasn't fully present in your relationship? Sarah thought about this question, really considered it for the first time since her divorce. There had been signs, she realized. David's emotional distance, his lack of enthusiasm for physical intimacy, the way he seemed to be performing the role of husband rather than naturally inhabiting it. Maybe, she admitted. What signs do you see with James? Sarah closed her eyes, thinking about her months of working with James, eating lunch with him, talking through complex problems together. She thought about his genuine engagement with her ideas, his obvious pleasure in her company, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. None, she said quietly. None, Elena confirmed. So maybe the problem isn't that you're bad at recognizing reality. Maybe the problem is that you're letting David's deception make you doubt perfectly clear evidence about someone completely different. Over the next few days, Sarah avoided the foundation, claiming she needed time to process the latest revelations about her invalid marriage. She spent hours researching legal implications, discovering that she had no financial liability for the bigamy since she'd been unaware of it, but also realizing that the experience had shattered her confidence in her ability to navigate relationships. James called twice, leaving gentle voicemails asking if she was okay and assuring her that she could take all the time she needed. His messages were patient and understanding, without pressure or demands for explanation. These qualities that she'd come to value in him now felt threatening, as if his kindness might be masking deceptions she wasn't perceptive enough to recognize. On Thursday afternoon, Marcus called her directly. Sarah, I hope it's okay that I'm reaching out, he said. David wanted to call himself, but I thought it might be easier coming from me. It's fine, Sarah said, though she wasn't sure it was. We wanted you to know that we've hired an attorney to investigate Vanessa's claims about the divorce paperwork. If there really was a clerical error that left David legally married to her, we're going to fix it and make sure she can't use it to hurt anyone else. Thank you, Sarah said, touched by their concern for her welfare despite the awkwardness of the situation. Also, Marcus continued, I want you to know that what Vanessa said about David leaving her for you isn't true. David left Vanessa because she was manipulative and controlling. He didn't even know he was attracted to men when he divorced her. Meeting you, marrying you, that was all genuine on his part, even though it ultimately didn't work out. This information provided some comfort, but it didn't address Sarah's larger struggle with trusting her own judgment. Marcus, Sarah said, when you and David started your relationship, how did you know it was real? How did you trust that he wasn't just experimenting or trying to figure himself out at your expense? Marcus was quiet for a moment. I think trust is always a leap of faith to some extent, but with David, I could see that his feelings for me scared him as much as they excited him. People don't usually put themselves through that kind of emotional upheaval unless something genuine is happening. But what if you'd been wrong?
Then I would have been heartbroken, but I still would have been glad I tried. Being afraid of getting hurt isn't a good enough reason to avoid all meaningful connections. After ending the call with Marcus, Sarah found herself thinking about James and the way he'd looked when she'd rejected his offer to drive her home from the party. She'd hurt him by shutting him out, and her fear of being deceived again was causing her to push away someone who had never given her any reason for suspicion. Friday morning, Sarah returned to the foundation for the first time since the party. James was in his office, reviewing grant applications, and he looked up with obvious relief when she appeared in his doorway. "How are you?" he asked, immediately putting aside his work to focus on her. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, stepping into his office and closing the door behind her. "I'm sorry for shutting you out when you were trying to help me." "You don't need to apologize," James said gently. "You just received shocking news about your past. It's natural that you'd need time to process." "It's not just that," Sarah said, sitting down across from his desk. "I've been letting my fear of being deceived again prevent me from recognizing what's real and good right in front of me." James leaned back in his chair, studying her expression. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I've developed feelings for you that go beyond friendship, but I've been too scared to acknowledge them because my judgment about relationships has been so wrong before." The words hung between them, honest and vulnerable, in a way that terrified Sarah, even as she felt relieved to have spoken them. "Sarah," James said carefully, "your judgment wasn't wrong before. You were dealing with people who were hiding fundamental truths about themselves. I'm not hiding anything from you." "I know that intellectually," Sarah replied, "but emotionally, it's been hard to believe that I could recognize the difference." James came around his desk and sat in the chair next to hers, close enough that she could see the sincerity in his eyes. "What would help you feel more confident about your judgment?" "Time," Sarah said immediately, "and honesty. Complete honesty about everything, even if it's uncomfortable or unflattering." "I can do that," James said without hesitation. "Ask me anything you want to know." For the next hour, Sarah asked James every question she could think of about his past relationships, his feelings about commitment, his long-term goals, his fears and insecurities. James answered everything with a directness that was both refreshing and reassuring, never deflecting or minimizing difficult topics. "My last serious relationship ended 2 years ago," he explained when Sarah asked about his romantic history. "We'd been together for 4 years, but she wanted children, and I wasn't sure I was ready for that level of responsibility. We tried to compromise for a year, but ultimately we both realized we wanted different futures." "Do you want children now?" Sarah asked. "I think so, with the right person. But I'm also aware that I'm 34, and if I'm going to be a father, I need to make that decision relatively soon." "What about marriage?"
I believe in marriage when it's between people who genuinely complement each other and want to build something together. I don't believe in marriage as a default next step in relationships. These conversations continued over several weeks as Sarah and James navigated the transition from friendship to something deeper. They took things slowly, both recognizing that Sarah needed time to rebuild her confidence in her emotional instincts. The breakthrough came during a quiet evening in January when they were working late at the foundation, preparing for a major grant presentation to the city council. They'd ordered dinner and were eating in James's office, discussing strategy for the presentation, when Sarah realized she felt completely comfortable and natural with him in a way she'd never experienced with David. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said, setting down her chopsticks. "Always," James replied. "When you look at me, what do you see?" James considered the question seriously. "I see someone who is brilliant at understanding complex systems, both financial and human. I see someone who cares about fairness and justice, who wants to use her skills to help people rather than just make money. I see someone who has been hurt but hasn't let that hurt make her cynical or cruel." He paused, then continued. "And I see someone I'm falling in love with, if that's something you want to hear." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes, not from sadness but from relief. "I see someone I'm falling in love too," she admitted. "Someone who makes me feel like myself again, but a better version of myself." James reached across the desk and took her hand. "So what do we do now?" "Now we see where this goes," Sarah said, squeezing his fingers.
honestly and openly, without letting fear make our decisions for us. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the foundation's main gallery space, which had been transformed for an evening celebrating the artists they'd supported throughout the year. She wore a blue dress that Elena had helped her pick out, and she felt genuinely happy in a way that still surprised her sometimes. James appeared at her side, handsome in a dark suit that made his eyes look even more striking than usual. "Ready for this?" he asked, gesturing toward the crowd of artists, donors, and board members who were mingling throughout the space. "More than ready," Sarah replied, meaning it completely. As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself in conversations about art and funding, about the intersection of creativity and commerce, about the foundation's plans for expansion into educational programming. These discussions energized her in a way that her traditional accounting work never had. "You're a natural at this," James observed during a quiet moment between conversations. "Have you given any more thought to making this transition permanent?" Sarah had been considering leaving Morrison & Associates to work full-time with the foundation, using her financial expertise to help arts organizations throughout the region develop sustainable funding models. "I think I'm ready," she said. "It feels like the right next step." "Good," James said, his smile conveying both professional and personal satisfaction. "Because I have something I want to ask you." Before Sarah could respond, James was kneeling beside her, pulling a small velvet box from his jacket pocket. The conversations around them gradually quieted as people noticed what was happening. "Sarah Martinez," James said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "You've taught me that sometimes the most beautiful things come from the most unexpected places. You've shown me what it means to be partners in every sense of the word. Will you marry me?" Sarah looked down at the man who had helped her rebuild her faith in love, in trust, in her own judgment. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from devastating betrayal to genuine happiness, from isolation to connection. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain. "Yes, absolutely yes." As James slipped the ring onto her finger and stood to kiss her, the gallery erupted in applause from the assembled artists and supporters. Sarah felt surrounded by people who celebrated creativity, authenticity, and the courage to build something beautiful from difficult circumstances. Later that evening, as they walked hand in hand through Seattle's streets, Sarah reflected on how different this engagement felt from her first one. With David, there had always been an undercurrent of performance, of trying to be the person she thought he wanted her to be. With James, she felt completely herself, confident that he loved her exactly as she was. "No regrets?" James asked as they reached Sarah's apartment building. "None," Sarah said without hesitation. "Everything that happened before brought me here, to this moment, to you. I wouldn't change any of it." As they walked upstairs together, Sarah realized that the story she'd tell their future children wouldn't be about the deception and betrayal that had ended her first marriage. It would be about the resilience and wisdom that had made her ready for a love worth waiting for, and the courage to trust her heart when it finally led her somewhere true. 8 months had passed since Sarah's world had been turned upside down by the discovery of David's deception, and she was finally beginning to feel like herself again. The autumn air in Seattle carried the crisp promise of change as she walked through Pike Place Market on a Saturday morning, stopping at her favorite coffee vendor before heading to the Pacific Northwest Arts Foundation for a special weekend event. The foundation had become more than just a workplace for Sarah. It had become a sanctuary where she could channel her analytical skills towards something meaningful while surrounded by people who valued authenticity and creativity. Her consulting work had evolved into a full-time position as their Director of Financial Development, a role that allowed her to help artists secure funding while ensuring the foundation maintained its fiscal responsibility. James had been instrumental in helping her navigate this career transition, but more importantly, he had shown her what a healthy relationship could look like. Their romantic involvement had developed slowly and naturally over the past 6 months, built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine compatibility that felt entirely different from her marriage to David. The weekend event that had brought Sarah to the foundation on this Saturday was a celebration of their latest initiative, a program that provided microloans to emerging artists who needed capital to purchase equipment, rent studio space, or fund their first major exhibitions. Sarah had designed the financial framework for the program, working closely with local banks and credit unions to create a lending structure that recognized artistic potential as legitimate collateral. As she entered the foundation's main gallery space, Sarah was struck by the energy and excitement that filled the room. 30 artists had received loans through the program, and their work was now on display in a group exhibition that showcased the diversity and innovation that the funding had made possible. Photographers displayed images printed on materials they'd never been able to afford before. Sculptors presented pieces created with professional-grade tools, and painters showed canvases that demonstrated the difference that high-quality supplies could make in their artistic expression. James was near the entrance, greeting visitors and explaining the loan program to potential donors. When he saw Sarah arrive, his face lit up with the kind of genuine pleasure that still made her heart skip a beat after all these months together. "Perfect timing," he said, moving to her side and placing a gentle hand on her lower back. "The Seattle Times photographer just arrived, and I was hoping you could explain the financial structure of the program for their article." Sarah found herself energized by the prospect of discussing their innovative approach to arts funding. The loan program represented everything she valued about her work at the foundation. It was financially sound, socially beneficial, and demonstrated that creative pursuits could be treated as legitimate business investments rather than charitable causes. The interview with the Times reporter went well, and Sarah felt proud as she described how they'd structured the loans to account for artists' irregular income patterns while still maintaining the accountability that lenders required. Several board members overheard the conversation and nodded approvingly at Sarah's clear explanation of the program's financial safeguards. "You're a natural at this," commented Margaret Chen, one of the foundation's longtime board members and a prominent Seattle philanthropist. "Have you considered expanding this model to other cities? I have connections with arts organizations throughout the Pacific Northwest who would be interested in implementing similar programs." The suggestion intrigued Sarah, who had been thinking about ways to scale their successful innovations beyond Seattle. As she and Margaret discussed the possibilities, Sarah realized how much her professional confidence had grown since joining the foundation. The combination of meaningful work and a supportive environment had allowed her to develop skills and perspectives she'd never had the opportunity to explore in traditional accounting roles. The day progressed smoothly, with steady streams of visitors viewing the exhibition and learning about the loan program. Sarah found herself in numerous conversations about the intersection of art and economics, discussing everything from the tax implications of selling artwork to the challenges that creative professionals face when trying to secure traditional business loans. During a quiet moment in the afternoon, James approached her with 2 cups of coffee and a concerned expression. "Everything okay?" Sarah asked, accepting the coffee gratefully.
"We have a situation developing," James said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't being overheard. "I just got a call from our insurance company. They're questioning some of the claims we filed after the break-in last month." Sarah remembered the incident well. Someone had broken into the foundation's offices during a weekend night, apparently looking for cash or easily portable valuables. The thieves had caused significant damage to several offices while searching through desks and filing cabinets, but they'd ultimately left empty-handed since the foundation rarely kept cash on the premises. "What kind of questions?" Sarah asked, her forensic accounting instincts immediately engaging. "They're suggesting that the damage was too extensive for a simple burglary, and they want to investigate whether it might have been an inside job designed to hide embezzlement or other financial irregularities." Sarah felt a familiar surge of indignation at the implication that the foundation's financial practices might be questionable. She'd been working closely with their books for months and knew that their record-keeping was meticulous and their financial controls were stronger than those of most organizations their size. "That's ridiculous," she said firmly. "I can provide them with whatever documentation they need to prove that our finances are completely transparent." "I was hoping you'd say that," James replied, his relief evident. "But there's another complication. The insurance investigator they're sending is someone you know, Daniel Morrison." Sarah's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. Daniel Morrison was a senior partner at Morrison & Associates, her former accounting firm. He was known throughout Seattle's business community as a thorough and relentless investigator who had built his reputation on uncovering financial fraud in high-profile cases. "Did you tell him I work here now?" Sarah asked. "No, I thought you should decide how to handle that revelation. He might recuse himself from the case if he knows about your involvement, or he might see it as an opportunity to prove his objectivity by investigating his former employee."
Sarah considered the implications of both scenarios. If Daniel recused himself, it would delay the investigation and potentially damage the foundation's reputation by suggesting that there was something suspicious about Sarah's involvement. If he proceeded with the investigation, she would be in the uncomfortable position of having her professional work scrutinized by someone who knew her personal history and might question her judgment based on her failed marriage. I think we should be proactive, Sarah decided. I'll call Daniel myself and explain the situation. It's better that he hears about my role here directly from me rather than discovering it during his investigation. James nodded, though she could see he was concerned about the potential complications this might create. Are you sure? We could try to request a different investigator. That would just raise more questions, Sarah pointed out. Besides, Daniel is actually one of the most fair and thorough investigators in the city. If anyone can quickly establish that the foundation's finances are clean, it's him. That evening, Sarah called Daniel from her apartment, reaching him at his home number that she still remembered from her years at the firm. "Sarah Rodriguez," Daniel said when he answered, using her former married name out of habit. "I heard about your divorce. I'm sorry things didn't work out with David." "Thank you," Sarah replied, not bothering to correct the name confusion. "Actually, that's part of why I'm calling. I wanted to give you a heads up about something before you start your investigation tomorrow." She explained her role at the Pacific Northwest Arts Foundation, emphasizing that she'd joined the organization several months after the alleged financial irregularities would have occurred, if any existed at all. "I see," Daniel said thoughtfully. "This does create an interesting situation. On one hand, your involvement suggests that the foundation takes financial accountability seriously enough to hire someone of your caliber. On the other hand, it means I'll be investigating the work of someone I trained personally." "I understand if you need to recuse yourself," Sarah offered. "Actually, I think the opposite is true," Daniel replied. "I know your work well enough to spot any irregularities that might indicate problems. And more importantly, I trust you enough to believe that if there were any real financial issues at the foundation, you would have identified and addressed them already." This vote of confidence from her former mentor meant more to Sarah than she'd expected. Daniel had been one of the most demanding supervisors she'd ever worked for, but also one of the most supportive of her professional development. There is one thing I should mention. The insurance company didn't request this investigation randomly. They received an anonymous tip suggesting that the break-in was staged to cover up financial misconduct. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "An anonymous tip? Do you have any details about who might have made it?" "Not yet, but I plan to investigate that angle as thoroughly as the financial records themselves. Someone wanted this foundation investigated, and I want to know why." After ending the call with Daniel, Sarah found herself feeling uneasy in a way she hadn't experienced in months. The foundation had been her safe haven, the place where she'd rebuilt her confidence and found meaningful work. The idea that someone might be deliberately trying to damage the organization felt like a personal attack on the new life she'd constructed. She called James to update him on her conversation with Daniel, and he immediately offered to come over to discuss strategy for the investigation. "You don't need to do that," Sarah said, though she was touched by his willingness to support her through what could be a stressful situation. "I want to," James replied simply. "We're partners in this, both professionally and personally. Whatever challenges the foundation faces, we'll handle them together." When James arrived at Sarah's Capitol Hill apartment an hour later, he brought takeout from her favorite Thai restaurant and a bottle of wine that they could share while discussing the investigation. Sarah's apartment had gradually accumulated touches that reflected her relationship with James. Art books he'd recommended, a small sculpture created by one of the foundation's artists, photographs from weekend trips they'd taken to explore the Pacific Northwest's natural beauty. "I keep thinking about who might have made that anonymous tip," Sarah said, as they settled on her couch with their dinner. "The timing is suspicious, coming just a few months after I started working at the foundation full-time." "You think someone is targeting you specifically?" James asked. "Maybe. Or maybe someone is targeting the foundation and sees my involvement as a way to make the accusations seem more credible." Sarah took a sip of wine, trying to organize her thoughts. "The thing is, I can't think of anyone who would want to hurt me professionally. I left Morrison & Associates on good terms. I don't have any enemies in the Seattle business community, And my divorce from David was relatively amicable. What about David's ex-wife? James suggested, the one who was never properly divorced from him? Sarah had almost forgotten about Vanessa Chen, the woman whose deliberate inaction regarding divorce paperwork had technically invalidated Sarah's marriage to David. The situation had been resolved months ago when David and Marcus hired attorneys to force the completion of the original divorce proceedings, but Vanessa had been bitter and vindictive throughout the process. It's possible, Sarah acknowledged. Vanessa was angry about David's relationship with Marcus, and she specifically blamed me for somehow facilitating it. But targeting the foundation seems like an elaborate way to get revenge on me.
Unless she knows that the foundation is important to you now, James pointed out. If she's been keeping track of your life since the divorce situation was resolved, she might have discovered that attacking the foundation would be the most effective way to hurt you. The possibility that Vanessa might be orchestrating an attack on the foundation made Sarah feel sick. The idea that her past could reach out and threaten the future she'd built felt like a violation of everything she'd worked to achieve. Even if Vanessa is behind this, we can't prove it unless Daniel's investigation uncovers evidence of her involvement, Sarah said. Our best strategy is to be completely transparent and cooperative and trust that the foundation's clean financial records will speak for themselves. James reached over and took her hand, his touch providing the comfort and reassurance that had become essential to Sarah's sense of well-being. Whatever happens, we'll get through it. The foundation's work is too important to be derailed by false accusations, and your integrity is beyond question. The investigation began Monday morning, with Daniel arriving at the foundation, accompanied by a junior associate and a forensic accountant from an independent firm. Sarah had prepared comprehensive financial records going back 3 years, organized in a way that would allow the investigators to quickly verify the foundation's fiscal responsibility. Daniel was professional and thorough, treating Sarah with the same courtesy he showed to James and the other staff members, while making it clear that their personal history wouldn't influence his investigation. He asked pointed questions about the foundation's financial controls, the approval process for expenditures, and the documentation supporting their grant disbursements. "Your record-keeping is exceptional," Daniel commented to Sarah during a brief private moment. "Most nonprofits this size don't have nearly this level of financial documentation." "That's because most nonprofits this size don't have a forensic accountant designing their systems," Sarah replied with a slight smile. The investigation proceeded smoothly for the first 2 days, with Daniel's team finding no evidence of financial irregularities or internal misconduct. The foundation's books were clean, their grant distributions were properly documented, and their expense reports showed exactly the kind of modest operational costs that would be expected from an organization focused on supporting artists rather than enriching administrators. On Wednesday morning, however, Daniel requested a private meeting with Sarah and James to discuss a concerning development. "I've been trying to track down the source of the anonymous tip that triggered this investigation," Daniel explained as they settled in James's office. "The insurance company received the tip through their fraud hotline, but the caller refused to provide identification or specific evidence of wrongdoing." "That sounds like someone with a personal grudge rather than legitimate concerns about financial misconduct," James observed. "That's what I thought initially," Daniel agreed, "but then I discovered something interesting. The call was placed from a phone number registered to a private investigation firm here in Seattle." Sarah felt her stomach drop. A private investigator was involved in making the tip? It appears so. The firm is called Pacific Research Associates, and they specialize in background investigations and corporate intelligence gathering. I contacted them to inquire about the tip, but they claim client privilege and refuse to reveal who hired them or what information they provided to the insurance company. "Can you compel them to reveal their client?" Sarah asked. "Possibly, but it would require legal action that could take months. However, I did learn something else that might be relevant to your situation." Daniel paused, clearly choosing his words carefully. "Pacific Research Associates has been conducting surveillance on you personally for at least the past 6 months. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Someone had been watching her, following her movements, documenting her activities for months without her knowledge. The violation of privacy felt almost as traumatic as discovering David's original deception. "Surveillance?" James asked, his voice tight with anger. "What kind of surveillance?" The kind that would allow someone to know about Sarah's work schedule, her relationship with you, her involvement with the foundation's financial operations, Daniel explained. Whoever hired the private investigators wanted detailed information about Sarah's new life after her divorce. Sarah's mind raced as she considered who might have the motivation and resources to conduct such extensive surveillance. Vanessa Chen was the obvious suspect, but hiring private investigators for months of surveillance suggested a level of obsession and financial commitment that seemed extreme even for someone as vindictive as David's ex-wife. Is there any way to find out who's been paying for this surveillance without going through the private investigation firm? Sarah asked. I'm working on that, Daniel replied. Bank records, credit card payments, business filings. If someone has been spending significant money on private investigators, there should be a paper trail somewhere. The meeting concluded with Daniel assuring them that his investigation of the foundation's finances was nearly complete and that he expected to issue a report clearing them of any wrongdoing within the next few days. However, the revelation about the surveillance cast a shadow over what should have been good news. After Daniel left, Sarah and James sat in his office trying to process the implications of being watched for months without their knowledge. I feel violated, Sarah said, struggling to put her emotions into words. Someone has been documenting my private life, watching me when I thought I was safe and anonymous. We need to consider that whoever is behind this might escalate their behavior, James said, his concern evident. If they've been watching you for months and now their attempt to damage the foundation has failed, they might try more direct approaches. The idea that she might be in actual physical danger had never occurred to Sarah, but James's concern made her realize how little she knew about the person or persons who had been orchestrating this surveillance. Should we contact the police? She asked. I think we should at least file a report, James agreed. Even if they can't do much about private investigators who haven't technically broken any laws, there should be a record of what's been happening in case the situation escalates. That afternoon, Sarah and James went to the Seattle Police Department's Capitol Hill precinct to file a report about the surveillance. The detective who took their statement was sympathetic, but explained that private investigation, even when conducted without the subject's knowledge, wasn't illegal as long as the investigators stayed on public property and didn't engage in harassment or stalking behaviors. However, Detective Maria Santos added, if this surveillance is part of a pattern of harassment or intimidation, that could be a different story. We'll keep your report on file, and if you discover any evidence of threats or direct contact from whoever is behind this, please contact us immediately. Leaving the police station, Sarah felt frustrated by the limited options available to protect herself from whoever had been watching her. The knowledge that someone had been documenting her movements for months made her feel paranoid about her daily routines and suspicious of strangers she encountered in public. I hate feeling like this, she told James as they walked back to his car. For the first time in months, I was feeling confident and secure, and now I'm looking over my shoulder again. We're going to figure out who's behind this, James assured her. Daniel is good at following money trails, and whoever hired those private investigators had to pay them somehow. That evening, Sarah found herself unable to concentrate on anything except the disturbing revelation about the surveillance. She kept thinking about moments over the past months when she'd felt like someone was watching her, incidents she dismissed as paranoia or coincidence that now seemed potentially significant. There had been the same car she'd noticed parked near her apartment building on multiple occasions, the man in the coffee shop who'd seemed to be taking pictures with his phone, the woman who'd asked seemingly innocent questions about her work at the foundation during a community event. Any or all of these encounters could have been part of the surveillance operation that had been documenting her life. Elena called during dinner, as she did most weeknights, and immediately noticed the tension in Sarah's voice. "What's wrong?" Elena asked, with the directness that Sarah had come to rely on from her older sister. Sarah explained the situation with the insurance investigation and the discovery of the surveillance, watching Elena's expression shift from concern to anger as the implications became clear. "Someone has been stalking you for months," she said flatly. "This isn't just about trying to damage the foundation. This is about someone who's obsessed with controlling or punishing you." "But who?" Sarah asked. "I keep coming back to Vanessa, but this level of surveillance seems like overkill even for someone as vindictive as she was during the divorce proceedings." "Maybe it's not about vindictiveness," Elena suggested. "Maybe it's about something else entirely."
Money, reputation, some other kind of leverage that we haven't considered. Elena's observation made Sarah think about other possibilities beyond simple revenge.
What if the surveillance wasn't about punishing her for past actions, but about gathering information that could be used against her in some future scheme? I should review my financial records, Sarah realized. If someone has been watching me closely enough to know about my work at the foundation, they might also know about my banking, investments, credit cards. Maybe this isn't about the foundation at all. Maybe it's about identity theft or financial fraud. The possibility that she might be the target of a sophisticated financial crime rather than simple harassment was both more and less frightening than the idea of a personal vendetta. Financial crimes could be investigated and prosecuted, but they also suggested that the perpetrator might be more professional and dangerous than a bitter ex-wife acting out of spite. Thursday morning brought both good news and troubling developments. Daniel called early to report that his investigation of the foundation's finances was complete and that he would be issuing a report completely exonerating them of any financial wrongdoing. Your systems are actually better than those of most for-profit companies I've audited, Daniel told Sarah over the phone. Whoever made that anonymous tip either had completely false information or was deliberately trying to waste everyone's time. What about the surveillance? Any progress on identifying who hired the private investigators? That's where things get interesting, Daniel replied. I found the payment trail. The private investigation firm was paid through a series of cashier's checks purchased at different banks around the Seattle area. Someone went to considerable trouble to hide their identity, but they made one mistake. What kind of mistake? One of the cashier's checks was purchased at a bank branch that has very good security cameras. I'm working with the bank to get access to the footage from the date the check was purchased. This development represented the first real hope Sarah had felt since learning about the surveillance. If Daniel could identify who had purchased the cashier's check, they would finally know who had been orchestrating the investigation and the surveillance. How long before you can get the footage? Sarah asked. The bank's security department promised to have it ready by this afternoon. I'll call you as soon as I know something. Sarah spent the rest of the morning trying to focus on her work at the foundation, but she found herself constantly checking her phone for updates from Daniel. James noticed her distraction and suggested they take a walk around the neighborhood to clear their heads while waiting for news. Whatever Daniel discovers, we'll deal with it, James assured her as they strolled through the eclectic mix of galleries, cafes, and boutiques that surrounded the foundation's building. The important thing is that the foundation has been completely cleared of any wrongdoing, and your professional reputation is intact. I know, Sarah replied, but I can't shake the feeling that whoever is behind this isn't going to give up just because their first attempt failed. If they've been willing to spend months and thousands of dollars on surveillance and false accusations, they're probably not going to walk away quietly. James stopped walking and turned to face her, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. Sarah, I need you to know that whatever happens, I'm not going anywhere. You don't have to face this alone. The sincerity in his voice and the steadiness of his gaze reminded Sarah of how much her life had changed since meeting James. With David, she'd often felt like she was managing crises in isolation, even within their marriage. With James, she felt supported and protected in ways that allowed her to be vulnerable without feeling exposed. I love you, she said, the words coming naturally despite the stress of their current situation. I love you too, James replied, leaning down to kiss her forehead, and we're going to get through this together. Daniel's call came at 3 o'clock that afternoon, just as Sarah was finishing a grant review meeting with several of the foundation's board members. I've got the security footage, Daniel said without preamble, and you're not going to believe who purchased that cashier's check. Who? Sarah asked, stepping into James's office for privacy. Chen, David's boyfriend. The revelation was so unexpected that Sarah had to sit down. Marcus? That doesn't make any sense. Why would Marcus want to investigate me or damage the foundation? I don't know yet, but I've got clear footage of him purchasing the cashier's check that was used to pay the private investigators. There's no question about his identity. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to understand why Marcus would be involved in surveilling her. He'd always seemed genuinely remorseful about the affair with David, and their few interactions since the divorce had been cordial and respectful. Could someone else be using his identity? Sarah asked. Credit card fraud, stolen identification, something like that? It's possible, but the footage shows someone who matches Marcus's physical appearance purchasing the check with cash. Either it's really him, or someone who looks remarkably similar has access to identification documents in his name. After ending the call with Daniel, Sarah immediately called James to update him on this shocking development. They agreed to meet at Sarah's apartment that evening to discuss how to handle the revelation about Marcus's apparent involvement. I think I need to confront Marcus directly, Sarah said, as she and James sat in her living room later that evening. If he's really behind the surveillance, I want to know why. And if someone is using his identity, he needs to know about it so he can protect himself. Are you sure that's safe? James asked. If Marcus is willing to hire private investigators to watch you for months, there's no telling how he might react to being confronted. I don't think Marcus is dangerous, Sarah said, though she realized her confidence was based on limited interactions with someone who might have been deceiving her for months. But you're right that I shouldn't meet with him alone. Maybe we could ask him to come to the foundation during normal business hours, somewhere public with other people around. Or we could ask David to be present, James suggested. If Marcus is acting without David's knowledge, David might be able to help us understand what's motivating this behavior. The idea of involving David in the situation felt uncomfortable to Sarah, but she recognized that he might be the key to understanding Marcus's motivations. Despite their failed marriage, Sarah had never known David to be deliberately cruel or vindictive, and she found it hard to believe he would approve of his boyfriend conducting surveillance on his ex-wife. Let me call David first, Sarah decided. I'll explain what we've discovered and see how he reacts. His response might tell us whether he's involved or whether this is something Marcus is doing on his own. Sarah's call to David that evening was one of the most awkward conversations of her life. She explained about the insurance investigation, the surveillance, and Daniel's discovery of Marcus's involvement, watching David's reaction through the video call they'd arranged. David's shock appeared genuine, and his immediate anger at Marcus's behavior seemed authentic rather than performed. "This is insane," David said, running his hands through his hair in a gesture Sarah remembered from their marriage. "Marcus never mentioned anything about hiring private investigators or watching you. I don't understand why he would do something like this." "You really didn't know?" Sarah asked, studying David's expression for any signs of deception.
I swear to you, Sarah, I had no idea. If I'd known Marcus was doing this, I would have stopped it immediately. This is stalking, and it's completely unacceptable. David's reaction convinced Sarah that he wasn't involved in the surveillance scheme, but it also raised new questions about Marcus's motivations and mental state. David, has Marcus been acting strangely lately? Paranoid? Obsessive? Anything that might explain this behavior? David was quiet for a long moment, clearly thinking through recent interactions with his boyfriend. Actually, yes. He's been asking a lot of questions about you over the past few months. What you're doing for work, whether you're dating anyone, how you're adjusting to the divorce. I thought he was just concerned about your well-being, but now I'm wondering if there was something more to it. What kind of questions specifically? He wanted to know about your financial situation, whether you'd received a fair settlement in the divorce. He asked about your family, your friends, your work at the foundation. He seemed particularly interested in your relationship with James, asking whether I thought it was serious. Sarah felt a chill as she realized the extent to which Marcus had been gathering information about her personal life, not just through professional surveillance, but also through casual conversations with David. I think Marcus might be obsessed with you, David said, voicing the conclusion that Sarah had been trying to avoid. Not romantically, but obsessed with the idea that he somehow represent a threat to our relationship or his happiness. A threat? How could I possibly be a threat to your relationship? I don't know, but Marcus has always been insecure about our marriage, even though it's been over for almost 2 years. He's worried that I might change my mind about being gay, or that I might leave him for a woman if the right opportunity presented itself. This revelation provided a possible motive for Marcus's behavior that Sarah hadn't considered. If Marcus viewed her as a potential rival for David's affections, he might have been conducting surveillance to gather information that could be used to discredit her or drive a wedge between her and David. But David, we barely speak anymore. I'm in a serious relationship with James. How could I possibly be a threat to your relationship with Marcus?
Logically, you couldn't, but Marcus's fears aren't entirely logical. He's been through several relationships where partners left him for women, and I think our marriage triggered some deep-seated insecurities that he's never fully addressed. After ending the call with David, Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions. She was relieved to learn that David wasn't involved in the surveillance, but she was disturbed by the realization that Marcus might be struggling with psychological issues that had made her a target of his obsession. "What do we do now?" James asked after Sarah had updated him on her conversation with David. "I think we need to confront Marcus, but with David present and in a controlled environment. If Marcus is acting out of psychological distress rather than malicious intent, maybe we can get him to stop the surveillance and seek professional help." James looked skeptical. And if he refuses? Or if his obsession is more dangerous than David realizes? Then we involve the police and pursue legal action to protect ourselves. But I'd like to try the direct approach first, especially if there's a chance that Marcus doesn't fully understand how inappropriate his behavior has been. The confrontation was arranged for the following Saturday afternoon at a coffee shop in Ballard that was public enough to provide safety, but private enough to allow for a serious conversation. David had convinced Marcus to meet under the pretense of discussing their relationship, without revealing that Sarah would be present with evidence of the surveillance. Sarah arrived early with James, choosing a corner table that would allow them to observe Marcus's reactions while maintaining a comfortable distance from other customers. When David and Marcus entered the coffee shop, Sarah could see Marcus's confusion and alarm when he spotted her and James at their table. "What's going on?" Marcus asked David as they approached, his discomfort obvious. "Sit down, Marcus," David said firmly. "We need to talk." Sarah had prepared for this confrontation by organizing all the evidence of Marcus's involvement in the surveillance: bank records showing the cashier's check purchases, security footage of him at the bank, documentation from the private investigation firm confirming the dates and scope of their surveillance activities. "Marcus," Sarah began, keeping her voice calm and non-accusatory, "we've discovered that you've been paying private investigators to conduct surveillance on me for the past 6 months. We'd like to understand why." Marcus's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, denial, fear, and finally resignation. He looked at David with an expression that seemed to plead for understanding before turning back to Sarah. "I never meant to hurt you," Marcus said quietly. "I was just scared that you might try to win David back, and I wanted to make sure you weren't planning anything that could damage our relationship." "Marcus," David said, his voice filled with disappointment and anger, "Sarah has been nothing but respectful of our relationship. She's moved on with her life, she's in love with someone else, and she has never given you any reason to feel threatened." "I know that logically," Marcus replied, tears beginning to form in his eyes. "But I've been left before, David. I've had partners who claimed they were gay, but then went back to women when it became convenient. I couldn't bear the thought of losing you the same way." Sarah found herself feeling genuinely sorry for Marcus, despite the violation of privacy his actions had caused. His fear seemed genuine, even if his response to that fear had been completely inappropriate. "Marcus, hiring private investigators to watch me was stalking," Sarah said, gently but firmly. "It was illegal, it violated my privacy, and it caused me significant distress. It also resulted in false accusations against the foundation where I work, which could have damaged the livelihoods of people who had nothing to do with our situation." "I never meant for the foundation to be investigated," Marcus said, his distress increasing. "The private investigators told me they'd found some irregularities in your financial situation, and I thought maybe you were planning to sue David for more money or something. I asked them to report what they'd found to make sure David was protected legally." This explanation revealed that Marcus had been manipulated by the private investigators, who had apparently fabricated evidence of financial irregularities to justify continuing their expensive surveillance operation. "Marcus," James interjected, "the foundation's finances are completely clean. Whatever the private investigators told you about irregularities was false. They were taking your money and lying to you about what they were finding." The realization that he'd been deceived by the people he'd hired seemed to devastate Marcus even more than being confronted about the surveillance itself. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with what appeared to be genuine remorse. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I never wanted to hurt anyone. I was just so scared of losing David that I convinced myself I was protecting our relationship. David reached over and placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, his expression conflicted between love and disappointment. Marcus, this has to stop. All of it. The surveillance, the investigations, the obsession with Sarah's life. You need to get professional help to deal with your insecurities, and you need to make things right with Sarah and the foundation. Over the next 2 hours, they worked out an agreement that addressed both the legal and emotional aspects of the situation. Marcus would cease all surveillance activities immediately and provide Sarah with documentation of everything the private investigators had discovered or fabricated about her life. He would pay for any legal costs associated with defending the foundation against the false accusation, and he would seek counseling to address the psychological issues that had motivated his behavior. I want to make this right, Marcus said as they prepared to leave the coffee shop. I know I can't undo the violation of your privacy, but I'll do whatever I can to repair the damage I've caused.
Sarah looked at this man who had been watching her for months, trying to reconcile his apparent remorse with the disturbing nature of his actions. I appreciate your apology, Marcus, but you need to understand that rebuilding trust is going to take time. The knowledge that someone was documenting my private life has made me feel unsafe in ways that won't be easily resolved. I understand, Marcus replied. I'll give you whatever information you need to feel secure, and I'll stay away from you and James completely unless you specifically request contact. After Marcus and David left the coffee shop, Sarah and James sat in their car processing the emotional intensity of the confrontation. How do you feel? James asked, studying Sarah's expression with concern. Relieved that we know the truth, but also sad that Marcus was suffering so much that he felt like this was his only option, Sarah replied honestly. His fear was real, even if his response was completely inappropriate. Do you think he'll actually follow through on his promises to stop the surveillance and get help? I think so. David's disappointment in him seemed to affect him more than any legal threats we could have made, and knowing that the private investigators were lying to him might help him understand how destructive his behavior had become. The resolution of the surveillance situation allowed Sarah to return her focus to the work and relationships that had brought her happiness over the past year. The foundation continued to thrive, with their loan program serving as a model for other arts organizations throughout the region. Sarah's relationship with James deepened as they navigated the challenges of blending their professional and personal lives while maintaining the mutual respect and independence that had drawn them together. 3 months after the confrontation with Marcus, Sarah received an unexpected letter from him. Inside was a check covering all the legal costs associated with defending the foundation, along with a note explaining that he was in therapy and had come to understand how his behavior had been a form of stalking that could have had serious legal consequences. I'm working on addressing the insecurities that led me to violate your privacy, Marcus wrote. I hope someday you'll be able to forgive me, but I understand if that's not possible. I just wanted you to know that I'm taking responsibility for my actions and trying to become a better person. Sarah showed the letter to James, who read it with the same mixture of relief and caution that she felt. It sounds like he's genuinely trying to change, James observed. Though I think we should remain vigilant for a while longer, just to make sure this resolution is permanent. Agreed, but I'm glad he's getting help. No one should have to live with the kind of fear and insecurity that drove him to such extreme behavior. As spring arrived in Seattle, Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her from the devastating discovery of David's deception to her current sense of contentment and security. The surveillance episode had been frightening and violating, but it had also demonstrated the strength of her relationship with James and her confidence in her own judgment. I've been thinking about something, Sarah said to James one evening as they walked along the shores of Puget Sound, watching the ferry boats navigate between the islands in the distance. What's that? A year ago, if someone had told me that I'd discover my husband was having an affair with his male coworker, that I'd change careers to work in arts funding, and that I'd fall in love with someone who understood me better than I understood myself, I would have thought they were describing someone else's life. James smiled, taking her hand as they continued their walk. Do you miss your old life?
The predictability, the clear career path, the assumptions you could make about how your future would unfold. Sarah considered the question seriously. Sometimes I miss the sense of security that came with thinking I had everything figured out, but I don't miss the feeling that I was living someone else's idea of what my life should look like rather than discovering what actually made me happy. And what does make you happy? This, Sarah said, gesturing toward the water and the mountains beyond, then turning to look at James. Work that feels meaningful, a relationship built on honesty and mutual respect, the sense that I'm finally living authentically rather than trying to fit into expectations that were never right for me in the first place. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the Foundation's main gallery space, which had been transformed for an evening celebrating the 2nd anniversary of their microloan program. The walls displayed artwork created by more than 100 artists who had received funding through the program, representing an incredible diversity of creative expression that had been made possible by the Foundation's financial support. James approached her during a quiet moment between conversations with donors and board members, carrying 2 glasses of champagne and wearing the kind of smile that made her heart skip a beat even after 2 years together. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, offering her one of the glasses. "Just thinking about how much has changed since the first time I walked into this building," Sarah replied. "I was so focused on protecting myself from being hurt again that I almost missed the opportunity to build something wonderful." "But you didn't miss it," James pointed out. "You were brave enough to take chances on new work, new friendships, and eventually on love again." Sarah looked around the gallery at the evidence of their shared accomplishments, artists whose careers had been launched by their funding, innovative programs that were being replicated by arts organizations in other cities, a sustainable model for supporting creativity that had proved both financially sound and socially beneficial. "We've built something pretty amazing together," she said, referring both to their professional collaboration and their personal relationship. "We have, and I'd like to build something even more amazing, if you're interested." Sarah turned to look at him more directly, noting something different in his expression that made her pulse quicken. "What did you have in mind?" James set down his champagne glass and reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small velvet box that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. "I was thinking we could build a marriage," he said, opening the box to reveal a beautiful vintage ring with a center stone surrounded by smaller diamonds. "Sarah Martinez, will you marry me?" The proposal wasn't entirely unexpected, as they'd talked about marriage in general terms over the past few months, but the reality of the moment still overwhelmed Sarah with emotion. She looked at this man who had helped her rebuild her faith in love and partnership, who had supported her through professional challenges and personal growth, who had shown her what it meant to be truly known and accepted by another person. "Yes," she said, her voice clear despite the tears that had started flowing. "Yes, absolutely yes." As James slipped the ring onto her finger, Sarah was aware of the gallery full of people around them, but her attention was focused entirely on the man who had become her partner in every sense of the word. The applause that erupted from their friends and colleagues felt distant compared to the intensity of the love and commitment she felt in that moment. Later that evening, as they walked home through Seattle streets hand in hand, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The discovery of David's deception had shattered her assumptions about love and trust, but it had also freed her from a relationship that had never been right for either of them. The surveillance episode with Marcus was frightening and violating, but it had also demonstrated her resilience and her ability to handle crisis with support from people who truly cared about her well-being. "No regrets?" James asked as they reached Sarah's apartment building, echoing a question he'd asked before during significant moments in their relationship. "None," Sarah replied without hesitation. "Every challenge, every disappointment, every moment of doubt led me here, to this life, to you. I wouldn't change any of it." As they climbed the stairs to her apartment together, Sarah realized that she was no longer the woman who had discovered those credit card charges 2 years ago. That woman had been devastated by betrayal and uncertain about her ability to trust her own judgment. The woman she had become was stronger, wiser, and more confident in her ability to build meaningful relationships based on honesty and mutual respect. The future stretched ahead of them full of possibilities,
A wedding to plan, a foundation to grow, artists to support, and a life to build together based on the kind of authentic love that Sarah had once thought was just a romantic fantasy. She had learned that real love wasn't about finding someone who would never disappoint or challenge her, but about finding someone whose disappointments and challenges could be faced together with honesty, compassion, and unwavering commitment to each other's happiness and growth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.